All right, everybody. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Today, our speaker is Mike Bowler. I'm really excited for him to be here today to talk about psychological safety. So, Mike, why don't I hand it off to you if you want to do a brief introduction and get started.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I am a longtime Agile coach. I started my journey with XP back in 1999. So it seems relevant for this group. So I've been doing Agile for a very long time. A number of years ago, I looked at all the things that I do as an Agile coach, and it sort of falls into three buckets of things. So there's all the skills training, there's all kinds of process improvement, and then the third bucket is all of this messy people stuff. And traditionally, of all the things that I did, the messy people stuff was my weakest area. So I made a deliberate attempt to get better at that. And that's taken me on the most fascinating journey into neuroscience, psychology, hypnosis, body language, and a whole bunch of other fields. And everything we're going to talk about today comes from those worlds. But we're going to tie it back to what we do in actual Agile development. So we do tend to talk a lot about psychological safety particularly in the corporate world. We say a lot of words around it, but quite frankly, most of what we say is platitudes. We don't tend to get into the depth of it. We say a lot of things like, it's good, you should do more of it, but we don't actually get into, well, what's really happening? Why should we change our environment? And what should we do about that? So that's what we're going to be doing tonight. We're going to be diving into some of the science and tying it back to how we can actually relate that at work. If we have questions at any time, feel free to stop me. Although I do have an agenda and specific things I want to get through, what's more important to me is that you walk away with the answers you need out of this session. Okay. So the high-level agenda that we're going to go through is, first of all, what is it? Because as I say, we do talk about it in platitudes. Why do we care? What's really going on in the brain? We're going to talk about the safety model, and time permitting, we'll do a little bit of an exercise at the end. I'm not sure if we'll have time for that tonight. So let's start off by looking at this. Sorry, before I do that, can you all see this annoying bar that's at the top of my screen, or are you actually just seeing the slide?
I only see the slide.
Just the slide, yep.
Perfect. Then I will ignore the annoying bar. So when we talk about psychological safety, Amy Edmondson first noticed an observable behavior. And this is that people who are psychologically safe will speak up when they see some things that seem wrong. And this is important because she started off by researching medical teams. So she wasn't doing software or anything like that. She was looking at medical teams in hospitals, and she was looking specifically at the medications that were being handed out. And she was looking at the error rates. And what she expected to find was that the most effective teams in terms of patient outcomes would have the lowest rates of medication errors. And that the reverse is also true, that the least effective teams would have the highest rates of medication errors. And what she found instead was the complete opposite. She found that the teams that were most effective in terms of patient outcomes had the highest rates of medication errors, and that the worst performing teams for patient outcomes had the best error rates, or the least errors. And this made no sense at all. So she dug further and further into this. And what she found out was this thing that she coined psychological safety. That was really an indication of how comfortable people were speaking about the problems they had. So that the teams that had the best patient outcomes, they spoke up when they saw a problem. And so they recorded far more medication errors than the other teams did, not because they made more mistakes, but because they were willing to admit to more mistakes. And because they were willing to admit to it, they were able to correct them more effectively, and they got better patient outcomes. Whereas the teams that weren't willing to admit it, for various reasons, would hide the fact that they had medication errors. So it looked like their numbers were better, but they had worse patient outcomes. So it's a really interesting thing. What she noticed was this observable behavior. Okay, so there's three different ways that we could look at psychological safety, and I've talked about the first one. It's this belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. This is a behavior. It's a very specific behavior. It's all about safety to act. The second one is with psychology generalizing a little bit and looking at it, it's not just how we act, but it's how we feel about the environments. So it's the ability to show and be one's true self without fear of negative consequences for self-image, status, or career. This is all about safety to be. But the third definition, which is where we're going to spend most of our time tonight, is all about looking at the neuroscience, the actual science of what's going on in our brain. And this is a neurological state in which we have access to our prefrontal cortex. And I'll get to the prefrontal cortex in a moment. I'll define that in a few slides on. But it's a very specific part of our brain. And we're saying that when we have access to this, we get the behaviors, we get the feelings. And when we don't have that part of our brain accessible, we don't have those things. So Amy Edmondson she put out a TED Talk and a number of others, a book, all talking about how she came up with this research. I do encourage you to at least go and watch the TED Talk. It's fascinating to watch. It's all about these medical teams. And this is where she first discovered all of these things. So I'm not going to play the video for you today, but I do encourage you to go and watch it. A different example I'm going to give you is written up in this book by David Marquet. He talks about the cargo ship El Faro that sank in the middle of a hurricane in 2015 with the loss of all lives on board. We know what happened on the El Faro because every conversation on the bridge was recorded. And so we can listen to the language patterns that were used. And that's what he writes about in the book. He talks about the language patterns as they apply to leadership. But the key thing is that because of the language that was used, there was a severe lack of psychological safety. And as a result, a whole bunch of people died. This is more severe than the medication errors, where perhaps people didn't get a strong enough dosage or too little. People did die in the El Faro example. This is the significance of psychological safety. But what about us? We are typically not dealing with life or death. Now, I know some of us do. Some of us write software for pacemakers and that sort of thing. But for the most part, most of us are not building software in life or death situations. So is it really important that we have psychological safety? Well, according to Google, it is. Now, if you know anything about Google, I'm sure you'll know that they are a little bit particular about measurements. They measure absolutely everything, and they use that to drive their decisions. So they went in and did this study back in 2015 to figure out what makes their most highly effective teams different from their least effective teams. Because obviously they thought if we can just get the secret sauce that makes these teams better, we can apply that secret sauce everywhere, and now we will have 1,000 spectacular teams instead of just a small handful of spectacular teams. So they studied 180 teams to start with. And they went through and did all kinds of analysis on all different vectors to try and figure out all the things that made the really effective teams be that way and what made the less effective teams be that way. And after some time, they came up with nothing. They couldn't get any correlation between different things. They expected to see that the teams that were more effective, it was all about the people. That's what they expected. They expected to see that, well, people with higher education would drive more effective teams. Better skills, perhaps it was tooling. The more effective teams must have better tools. But when they actually studied all of this, they found that none of those things were true. So then eventually they brought in some psychologists, and the psychologists asked them to do studies on different ways of looking at things. And what they finally determined were the 5 factors that are on the right. These are the factors that drive highly effective teams at Google. And you'll notice that psychological safety is number 1. So when we look at what makes a highly effective IT team doing agile development, psychological safety is right at the top. Now, the interesting thing is that of all 5 of them, none of them are about the people. It's not about what your skills were, what your education was, where you came from, who you know. It wasn't any of those things. It was more about how we chose to work together, which is a really interesting thing. But psychological safety is number 1. This is why it's relevant for us. If we want really effective teams, we need to build up that psychological safety.
Sorry, Mike,
So first, a couple of quick disclaimers here. The whole field of neuroscience is only about
Hey,
50
Mike.
years old.
I
Yeah,
think someone has a question.
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Mike. Sorry for interrupting your session.
No, please.
I'm not a native speaker of English, so please try to better understand me. I'm trying to ask a question about the very essence of psychological safety. As far as I can understand, I mean, speaking up about the things that may seem wrong requires psychological safety. But when I remember the scientists, for example, Galileo, how to say, he proposed the idea that the Earth is round and it turns around the sun. And he knew that when he stated that, he will be tortured or even killed. So there was actually no, how to say, physical, psychological safety. But still, he insisted proposing his idea. Can you please tell me a little about this? Because I cannot understand. There was no safety for him, but he still did it. And there are people like this, like heroes, do this stuff.
Yes.
Thanks.
You're correct. There will always be some people who speak up. There will always be some people who do what they feel is the right thing. The question is, how many of those people? Can we count on having people like him in our IT departments? We really can't. Those people are fairly rare, the people that will risk their own life in order to stand up for a principle that they believe in. So certainly we recognize that some people, even when they're completely faced with no safety at all, will speak up and do what they believe is right. But what we're talking about here are people in general. And so we need to recognize that most people will not. Does that help?
Yeah, partly, thanks. Yeah, of course, this is the only, how to say, explanation. We should also care for all people, yeah.
Yes. Okay, so back to this, just recognizing that things are changing constantly, and in 10 years from now, when we look back at what we know today, we'll probably think, oh, that was all foolish, we've learned new things. So recognize that what I'm going to show you tonight is what we currently believe, and some of it may turn out to be incorrect, much of it will be correct, and we're going forward from there. But I am citing actual research, and there will be links to all of that. The slides are fairly text heavy because you will be getting copies of these when we're done. I will send them to Anthony and he can distribute as needed. So I don't normally like a lot of text heavy slides, but I'm doing this because you might want to go and reference the actual studies. So coming back to this definition, psychological safety is a neurological state in which we have access to our prefrontal cortex. That's the piece in red on the diagram. And that is the part of our brain that does higher level rational thinking. This is the part of our brain that makes us different from most animals. Most animals don't have a prefrontal cortex. And so you could almost think of this as being the defining characteristic of being human. It is something that is unique to us. So it does higher level rational thinking. It's able to override emotional response. So in the example that we just gave of somebody willing to risk their own life to stand up, that their prefrontal cortex was able to override their fear so that they could step up and do the right thing. But the problem is that when the prefrontal cortex gets shut down, we're not able to do that anymore. So now we get to, at what point might our prefrontal cortex not be enabled? And this is when we get into our fear responses. When our amygdala, which is the sort of the sentry, the front door to our survival mechanism, when the amygdala recognizes that we have some potential danger in front of us, it triggers one of two different survival mechanisms. Over the millions of years that we've been evolving, we have in fact evolved two different survival mechanisms. One is far more ancient. We often refer to it as our reptilian survival mechanism, and that's the freeze response. And we have a much newer survival mechanism that is unique to mammals, which is the mobility response. And the mobility response really is only found in mammals, whereas the freeze response can be found in reptiles and all kinds of other different animals. When the amygdala gets triggered, it's going to activate one or the other of these. And the interesting thing is that both of them inhibit the prefrontal cortex. So looking down the left, if we get a mobility response, this is preparing us for fight or flight. The amygdala wakes up our sympathetic nervous system. That in turn starts pumping adrenaline into our system. It brings oxygen into our lungs. It pumps glucose into our muscles to get us ready for rapid movement. It does all kinds of interesting things that with the body to prepare us for that rapid movement. And because this is so energy intensive, it starts shutting down systems that it considers non-essential. So, for example, growth stops. Our fingernails stop growing, our hair stops growing when we're in this mobility response. Our immune system shuts down because the immune system is all about long-term survival. It's not necessary in a short-term survival response. And the last one, which is most relevant to today's talk, is that when we are getting ready for that mobility response, we shut down the prefrontal cortex. Because higher level rational thinking is not going to get us out of a situation where we're being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger. So we shut down the prefrontal cortex and we immediately respond. The prefrontal cortex just isn't fast enough. On the other hand, if we went with a freeze response, which again is a much older, the more reptilian form of our brain, with a freeze response, we do what we might all refer to as a deer in the headlights. We immediately freeze in place, and in fact, we often hold our breath. Well, for a reptile, that's not a problem. A reptile can hold their breath for minutes, sometimes hours at a time, with no damage to any of their systems. But when a mammal holds their breath for too long, we inhibit the oxygen to the brain, which means that the brain actually becomes inhibited, and we have a problem with that. So a strong freeze response actually blocks the amount of oxygen going to the brain, which again compromises our prefrontal cortex. So in either case, if we go into this survival mechanism, whether it is a little bit of a survival response or a full-blown response, either way, we're inhibiting and sometimes completely shutting down the prefrontal cortex. This is what we're talking about with psychological safety. It means that our prefrontal cortex is at least inhibited, possibly shut down completely. So what happens when we're in this mobility response? Well, we react poorly. We're more likely to misread social cues. If we're in some kind of a social environment and we're trying to read the cues off other people to see what they're doing, what they're about to do, we misread those. We tend to assume negative intent. We intend to assume that people are more aggressive than they really were. And on top of all that, once we start to do those things and we get angry, that makes us more susceptible to false or misleading information. And we can see all of that in current events, of course, where people deliberately getting wired up and angry are now becoming more susceptible to misleading things. We're distracted by potential dangers. So if I'm in this survival mechanism and my prefrontal cortex is shutting down a little bit, all of a sudden I'm far more sensitive to things going around me. I notice somebody walking near me and that grabs my attention. Whereas I'm trying to focus on writing a document or focus on a conversation, and I'm distracted by all the little things around us. Interestingly, our middle ear adjusts. It actually tunes itself to adjust to amplify low frequency sounds. And it does that because our predators typically made low frequency sounds when they were approaching. And so our ear tunes itself to listen for the predators. And the side effect of that is that human conversation, being relatively high frequency, is more difficult to hear. So we actually have a harder time listening to human voices when we're in this place of lack of safety. We're also less capable of effective problem solving because all of this preparing for fight or flight uses up oxygen and glucose, which are needed for critical insight, analytical thinking, problem solving, short-term memory, etc. We get tired easily. I said that we're constantly looking at all of the distractions around us. I noticed that somebody picked up the phone, or I see somebody walk by. And so as we're doing that, our brain is being flooded with noradrenaline, which is really helping us focus, but keeping it going all the time just makes us exhausted. And because we are getting tired quickly, it's actually hard for the prefrontal cortex to get back again. It takes longer for it to recover once it's become tired. Then, of course, everything gets worse with chronic stress, where we're in this state all of the time. Our hippocampus, which is responsible for memories and all kinds of other things, actually begins to disintegrate, which is a really bad thing. Our body gets flooded with cortisol, which is often referred to as the stress hormone. And the cortisol is a fabulous thing in a short-term situation. If I reach over and I touch a hot stove, it's cortisol that forces my hand away. So cortisol is a fabulous thing in a short-term situation, but when cortisol is flooding through our system over the long term, it suppresses the immune system, increases blood pressure, and decreases learning ability. So all of this is a really bad thing. And then, of course, prolonged stress can cause the amygdala to grow in strength and size. And that means that it's going to be more likely to trigger you into a survival situation. So it's a vicious circle, that doing more of it makes you more susceptible to doing more of it. Now, there's some good news. Everything I've said up till now has been a bad news story, but there is some good news here. And this is that oxytocin, which is one of the friendly hormones, has the effect of suppressing the amygdala, which means that when we get a lot of oxytocin flooding through our brain, we become calmer. We're less likely to react, less likely to go into a survival response to that. Oxytocin comes through a sense of belonging, through social alliances. When we've got a good number of friends, if we're in an environment where we feel that the team has our back, this is again tying us back to agile development. If our team has our back and we know that we're working together on common things, the oxytocin is flowing. And as the oxytocin flows, it calms the amygdala. Laughter is fabulous for this. Laughter has all kinds of effects. If I can even get somebody to smile, they get a little shot of oxytocin. If I can get a good belly laugh out of somebody, the whole range of chemicals are flowing through the brain at that point. But oxytocin is the big one. You're getting a big shot of oxytocin, which again calms the amygdala and makes you feel safer and puts you into a better place. Oxytocin is additionally triggered by touch. This is touch with any mammal. So if we're in a back to office environment, for example, we're back there having the human touch with other people, touch with your family, all of these things are positive. Interestingly, this also works with any other mammal. So when I am stroking my cat, I am getting a shot of oxytocin, and so is my cat, because oxytocin is a characteristic of all mammals. And so we are both getting a shot of oxytocin as we're doing that. So oxytocin is a really good news story here. So now I want to introduce you to the safety model. And this is where these are specific things that we can address in our environments to make people feel safer. And the absence of these things will make people feel less safe. I do want to call out that not everybody has the same need for each one. So I, for example, might have a higher need for security, but not autonomy. You might have a higher need for autonomy, but not fairness. So as we go around the circle, recognize that not everybody is the same. We're all a little bit different. So we're going to start off the top with security. We have this need for predictability. So we all, as I stated at the top, we all do react a little bit differently. This is exactly what I said. So security is the brain's need for predictability. It's the 4 C's: consistency, commitment, certainty, and no change. And this is why we feel safer when we are able to adequately predict what's going on in our environment. It turns out that we have evolved to be astounding prediction engines, because as it happens, it was not enough for us ancestrally to be able to respond quickly to dangers. For us to survive, we had to be able to anticipate dangers. So if I could anticipate the saber-toothed tiger that was about to come out of the bushes, I was far more likely to survive than I was if I just reacted well when it jumped on me. So prediction is a significant part of our evolution. And this is true for all animals and plants. This is not uniquely a human characteristic, but that predictability is something that's quite astounding that we have evolved for. When our environment around us is predictable, we feel safer. When we are unable to predict the environment around us, we feel less safe. So step 1 here is that we need to have some level of security. We need to be able to anticipate what's going on in our environment around us. So a lot of what I just said right here, worth calling out, the prediction is such a useful capability that even single-cell creatures plan their actions predictively. We don't know how they do that, but it's true. This is plants and animals and single-celled organisms. We have all evolved to anticipate what's coming and not just react to it. Now, strangely and counterintuitively, we also like some novelty. So there's all kinds of benefits to novelty, to having things that are different and unique and fun, but we do need that level, a certain level of security Without that, the novelty is just dangerous. So in our environments, how we phrase feedback or suggestions can impact security. I'm sure we've all seen the reaction of your boss comes by and says, "Can you come into my office now?" And all of a sudden we begin to feel unsafe. Even if I have a good relationship with my boss, I start to feel unsafe. Well, what's going on? Am I being reassigned somewhere? Am I being fired? Is something bad going to happen? So we need to recognize that how we phrase all of the words that we use can make the people around us feel more or less safe. So we do need to be aware of that. Autonomy. We really, really don't like to be told what to do. Now,
Mike,
go ahead.
hey, this is Anthony. Just a quick question about that one, the phrasing commentary.
Yes.
I find that one interesting because I feel like it depends a lot on the history or the experiences that the listener has, right? So
Yes.
if you had let's, to use your boss's example, right? If they had a specific phrase that they used to try to bring safety, but they always delivered bad news with it, and you try to do the same thing, couldn't that make somebody feel not secure?
Oh, absolutely.
Based on just on the phrasing.
Absolutely. Phrasing is absolutely critical, and past history as well, to your point. That sure, that your boss might say all the right words, but past history has shown that when my boss says this, it might mean bad news.
Okay.
Or
Thanks.
It could be that my boss never gives me bad news just by calling it in, and therefore I know it's going to feel good. So it goes both ways, but phrasing is critically important. We do this in retrospectives. I mean, this is a key thing. If we're retrospecting about something went wrong, we push something into production and it blew up, and we're trying to dig into what went wrong so that we can get better at it. If I start asking questions like, well, who let it fall apart? Well, all of a sudden we're lacking security. I'm taking that security away because I ask a who question. If instead I'd ask, what did we notice? Or who first realized we had a problem? Those things are safe. So we need to be very careful about the wording we use. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that is. Thank you.
Perfect. So autonomy. So again, we don't want to be told what to do. And I know you're thinking right now, we can all point at people and say that person only ever wants to be told what to do. Right? There's some people will be say, no, they don't want to show any independence. They don't want to show any creativity. They just want to be told to do this thing and they'll do it. And the reality is that those people are lacking security. When you give them enough security, they will now want autonomy. They want to be able to make their own decisions. They want to be able to see what's going on, because this is a key driver for humans, is autonomy. And you'll see this in all kinds of models. It's not just in psychological safety, it's in motivation. We find that autonomy is a key piece in all of those factors. So we do want to know, we want to be able to make decisions for ourselves. And if we can't, then we start to feel threatened. Our amygdala will actually trigger if we keep getting told what to do, and we don't get to make decisions about that for ourselves. As I mentioned, you can get into motivation as well. It's really off the topic for this discussion tonight, but the Daniel Pink's Drive and the Self-Determination Theory, which I don't recommend. It's a brilliant book, but it's very thick and difficult to get through. They talk all about the motivation, and autonomy is a key piece of that as well. So fairness is fascinating. It turns out that if I perceive something as being unfair, so I'm in a work environment and I see somebody being unfair to somebody else, it activates a part of my brain called the ancillar insula. And that in turn suppresses my prefrontal cortex. Now, what's fascinating about this to me is that it's not just that somebody is unfair to me and I feel less safe. I can just perceive unfairness. If I see somebody being unfair to somebody else, all of a sudden, my ancillar insula is making me feel less safe, even though it didn't have anything to do with me, the thing that wasn't fair. So this is a key thing that we need to do. We need to build environments where people are treated fairly, because when we perceive other people being taken advantage of, we feel less safe. Then, of course, there is a productivity hit that goes along with that because there's decreased activation of the reward centers and that sort of stuff. Not quite related to psychological safety, but also important. Fairness is a key thing. Now, the opposite of that is also fascinating, that when we do experience fairness, when we see things going on that are fair in our environment around us, then we get a little bit of dopamine. Dopamine is the reward chemical. And so we get a little hit of dopamine to say, hey, that was a good thing, that thing that was fair. So having fairness in our environment is really, really important. Esteem is the next cycle around on the safety model. And this is all about our social status. So this is how people think of us. This is how we think of ourselves. This is our status within the group. You know, do people look to me and ask me questions about things, or do they, oh, I'm not going to ask him because he's going to say the wrong thing to me. So this social status, this esteem is critically important. And it has to do with our survival mechanism. A fascinating study here showing that disapproving facial expressions from some people can trigger the amygdala more than fear itself. And social rejection by way of insult or challenge has the same impact as physical pain. Now, if we look at this from an evolutionary perspective, it makes total sense, because if you are a member of the tribe and you get kicked out of your tribe, your survival chances just drop significantly. You are unlikely to survive long enough to reproduce and move on to the next generation if you've been kicked out of the tribe. So that social status is critically tied into our survival mechanism. Then we come around to trust. Trust is the next one on the cycle. We automatically distrust people who appear different than us, which always causes problems. When our prefrontal cortex is active, we can override that and we can say, yes, I recognize that this person is from a different culture than me, but that's okay. I can recognize that this person looks differently than me, but that's okay. So when my prefrontal cortex is active and strong, I can override these feelings of distrust. But when my prefrontal cortex is inhibited, I can't. And when we have that lack of trust, of course, it inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which has that, again, a vicious circle. Our brains are wired to differentiate into, well, loosely us versus them. It's a lot more granular than just us versus them. It's actually in groups and out groups, if we look at the psychology studies. But we are biased to automatically split people based on whether they're in our in groups or in our out groups. And our out groups we do not trust, our in groups we do. So an easy thing that you could do if you are returning to office, as many companies are now, is sit and eat with your coworkers. Because it turns out that the people that we eat with tend to be the in group. And so we can sort of trick our brains and say, this person can be trusted if we're going to eat with them. And so we build that trust just by having food with somebody. It doesn't have to be a full meal. It could just be a snack, could be coffee. But the point is that if we are eating with people, we tend to trust them more. Having trust causes the release of oxytocin in both directions. So if I trust you, then that releases oxytocin for me. If you trust me, that releases oxytocin for both of us as well. And of course, the oxytocin release calms the amygdala. Now, what I find really fascinating about it is that I will get that shot of oxytocin if somebody trusts me, even if I don't trust them. So it can be a one-way trust relationship, and both people are getting the benefit of the oxytocin. I find that fascinating. The quote from the bottom is from Stephen Covey of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, just talking about the cost, that hidden tax on not having trust. It is absolutely it's huge. It's huge, the cost to productivity if we don't have trust in our environment. It is possible to build up trust through exercises. There's all kinds of things that we can do. Something that I do a lot with teams to help build trust is things like mob programming, where we're all actively working together on a problem. It could be that we're doing some games together. It could just be going out for lunch. There's lots of things that we can do to help build the trust in our environment. The more trust we have, the more oxytocin is flowing, the calmer our amygdalas are, which makes us more likely to have our prefrontal cortex active. So trust, really important. The last one is a little bit of a cop-out, but not entirely. And this just reflects the fact that everybody is a little bit different. And so we do have the 5 main safety domains, the security and autonomy and fairness, etc. But we all are a little bit different also. So there's different things, your biases, our patterns, triggers. Not quite sure why that just did that. And all of these also have impact on our psychological safety. So let me do this again. Okay, so this is where we do a time check. Do we have time for an exercise to throw people into breakout rooms?
I think so. Yeah, I think we have about a half hour left, and usually we leave a little bit of time in that half hour to answer questions. So I think we have a little bit of time.
All right, well, if we could just take a little bit of time, this is actually on a Miro board that I've been doing. So I will paste the link to the Miro board into the chat. And if we want to put people into maybe 4, we got 16 people, so maybe 4 breakout rooms. If somebody could help me by setting up the breakout rooms.
Yep. Yeah, I got it.
Dear Mike, may I ask one question before we just put into different groups about the psychological safety?
Yes.
Can you please explain the, subject of sacrifice? You know, for example, mother animals sacrificing themselves for their, daughters or sons. I mean, there is no psychological safety in terms of animals because they are easily sacrifice themselves, and humans, if they are real humans, they can sacrifice themselves. Can you please explain this in terms of psychological safety? Thanks.
Well, this is, at this point, we're deeply into a protection mechanism, because when a mother is protecting her child, she's not thinking of her own safety anymore. She's thinking about the safety of her child. She is in a full mobility response, and she has, so her prefrontal cortex is shut down completely. She has no psychological safety anymore. The prefrontal cortex is completely shut down. She is now in a complete mobility response, and she will do whatever it takes to protect her child.
But it is still acting on the contradictory to his own survival.
Absolutely. But this is the survival of, well, again, from an evolutionary perspective, everything is about the surviving, passing our genes to the next generation. So we have evolved to protect our children. Because if we didn't, then we would have died out. So it makes total sense to me that we would put aside our own protection in order to protect the next generation coming along. I can't speak to a lot more about that because that's not an area that I've really researched.
Okay.
But it makes sense to me that that would be true.
Okay.
All right, Mike, I have some rooms ready to go. Do you want to go to one of the rooms as well?
Okay, let me put the Miro board in there first of all. So what I'd like you to do is on the board, if you could all join me there, you'll see down at the bottom, actually, I should have given you a link that's right down to the bottom. I can bring everybody to me. So we have the 6 areas down here. So if your room just wants to start in one area and move your way around by the arrows, and what I'd like you to do is come up with some ideas of how you could apply some of these things in your own environment when you go back to the office. So maybe you decide that fairness is an important thing that you want to work on. So in each area, just put some ideas down in one box and then move on to the next box. So we'll give this maybe 10 minutes, maybe, and just cycle through as many of the boxes as you can and put down things that seem interesting to you. And then we'll all come back again. We'll talk through a couple of things and I'll give you some recommended reading if this was interesting to you. Does that make sense so far? I will bounce between the rooms as we go.
Okay, Mike. Yeah, so you can just I don't know. I think I can put you in the different rooms as you want to go through them.
If you make me a co-host, I can just move myself around.
Perfect. Yeah, good idea. I'll do that.
So just put down some ideas, and maybe it's a situation you've seen before. Maybe it is something that you would like to apply, but something from each one of the areas. Feel free to scroll up. Everything that we've talked about so far is up above you on the board. So there's all kinds of reminders. And if you have any questions, just let me know.
Sounds good. So I'll open it up. Do you want to start a timer in Miro, or do you want me to keep time, Mike?
What? Yeah, let's. I'll start a timer on Miro.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and open the rooms.
Okay. We may want to pause the recording, because otherwise it's a lot of again. Okay, are we all back? We are all back. Welcome back. Okay, so we've got some things written down here. Were there any interesting conversations that came up?
I think so.
Please share.
Do you like regarding the notes on the board, or
Regarding anything that we've talked about tonight? So
Yeah,
the notes
so-
on the board, anything else?
Yeah, so we put three notes together. One of them was in the fairness box, one was in the U box, and one on the trust box. So yeah, but it was just interesting to explore it. You know, I made the suggestion for the fairness one, which is around the distribution of work. So like rotating through who does stand up and who does you know, the testing, or you know, whatever, and making sure that you know you're not just putting it on the most quiet person on the team as an example. In the U box, we talked about the you know, we have some Slack channels at work where people with interests they get together. You know, like we have a VR club and like a Magic the Gathering club. So that gives people to, you know, kind of share their hobbies. We also did a thing for folks that were that had like interesting side gigs, right? Or so we had somebody that, you know, had a whole bunch of snakes and he just showed off all the snakes and kind of did like a thing about it. So giving opportunities for people to share their outside of work selves. I did mention in that one though, which I think is important, not everybody wants to share that stuff, right? So how do you create it in a way that people don't feel obligated to do it, but you know, could still derive value from it? And then in the trust one, you know, Orlando, if you want to share your trust card, the one that you put in there.
Yeah, yeah. While listening at Mike's presentation, I realized that we are fully remote, but we have planned to go to the office every now and then, but we haven't been able to do that, or for some reason. I think it's really important to at least every 2 weeks and we are prior to pandemic, we were used to go to the office every day. So I think we can benefit a lot of having a work day together and having lunch special break perhaps to rekindle the
Perfect
connections between the team members. I think it's very important. We are forgetting this.
It's worth calling out that we can eat together even on a video connection, but it does require that everybody has their video on. All too often
Yes.
we say, oh no, I'm eating, so I'm going to go on mute and I'm going to turn my video off. Well, we've just lost all of the value from a psychological safety perspective of doing that eating together.
Yes. Sure.
So Debbie here, I'd like to tag on to that last comment a little bit earlier on the fairness post board there. And the discussion was about, making sure that the workload is distributed in a fair manner. But then the discussion also went into some people not liking or wanting or feeling comfortable in sharing their own stories. But I've been reading a good bit on the whole idea of, everybody's doing the diversity thing, right? But neurodiversity. So in a meeting, making sure that you take the time to say, who haven't we heard from, on this subject, or also saying things like, okay, well, let's, I'll digest that, think about that, and then going back to people afterwards, because some people don't, either want to or feel comfortable sharing right away, but they want to think about it a little bit longer because they're a little bit different in how they process. And so I think that's a really important aspect of it.
Absolutely.
Just to comment on that one too, I think it's really interesting sometimes where certain personality types can make it really hard to do that. So like being extra vigilant sometimes when you have, for lack of a better word, strong personalities,
Right.
to make sure that other people can participate.
Yes. Yes, certainly something to be aware of.
May I ask a question? How can we find a balance between sometimes, the security between autonomy, for example, and where is the balance? How people can know that, yes, I am balanced, this is the right way? Because these are fundamentally contradicting each other to the extreme, if you apply them all together. Where is the balance? How can
they're not actually contradictory. Security is all about our ability to predict our environment, and autonomy is all about making decisions about my environment. So I might be totally autonomous and still be able to predict what's going on around me, but they can come into conflict. I recognize that. And this is where we need to remember that everybody's different, that some people have a higher need for security and some people have a higher need for autonomy, and we need to help them get the thing that they need. And if we just have an open and candid conversation about that among our team, quite often people will admit, oh, yes, this is something that's important to me. Of course, that does require a little bit of safety for people to open up and say that. It's a bit of a vicious circle there. Or a catch-22, I suppose, would be better.
So to break the vicious circle, then the organizations need to offer their clients the different ways to express themselves, I think. Maybe this can break the vicious cycle. Different kinds of platforms to expand them. So maybe some people can express themselves by writing papers. Sometimes people prefer to talk. Maybe we can, increase the number of ways that people can express themselves, maybe.
Well, we can also begin to notice what the levels of psychological safety are in our environment. Do people speak up when we have a problem, or does everybody stay quiet? If everybody is already speaking up, then likely we're doing well on the 6 things here. But if nobody speaks up when there's a problem, well, maybe we're not. Maybe we need to do something actively to work on it. So it's not necessarily that we have to fix something. There may not be anything that's broken, or there might be. We need to look at the environment and see what we've got. I noticed there's a card down here, break bread with colleagues I'm having trust issues with. I would call that out, that it's a great idea in principle, but recognize that some people are inherently untrustworthy, and don't set yourself up for failure. So
okay.
use some common sense and recognize that, there might be a reason for you not trusting somebody. There might be a reason. There might be a good reason for not trusting somebody.
Good.
I'm always in favor of trying to improve the trust, but we need to recognize that not everybody has your best intentions at heart.
That's a good point. And I'm thinking of a particular colleague that I'm having a little difficulty with, and I thought, okay, well, let me try that, see if that works. But obviously going into it with, low expectations. I would say.
Yeah, it's still a good idea. Just be cautious. That's all. Okay. Anything else that came up that was interesting that you'd like to talk about? Any remaining questions?
Mike, do you mind if I ask another one, or would you just
Yeah,
get
go
mad at
ahead.
me because of just one final question? I thought that that all of these, how to say, security, autonomy, fairness, esteem, and trust can be fine. But what if we still sometimes don't, how to say, click with the people? We just cannot like them, or everything is fine, we can trust them, but we just innately, if we cannot love or like them, does it, how to say, violate the psychological safety of us or of the environment?
Well, there's a difference between not liking somebody and not trusting somebody. So first of all, I would want to address that one. If it's just that you don't like somebody, well, that's fair enough. You're not going to like everybody. But if you don't trust somebody, then I would try to dig a bit deeper into that. Why is that? Is there a good, solid reason for you not trusting that person? Or is it just that they're different?
In
So I
terms
would
of,
dig a
you can
little bit more into, trying to uncover what's really going on.
I mean, you can trust, no, there is no problem with the trust issue, but if you cannot just like them innately, I mean, would you still feel psychologically safe with them? Or I
Well,
don't know.
typically not liking somebody doesn't impact your psychological safety. Because again, psychological safety is all about our survival mechanism. I don't go into a survival reaction because I don't like somebody. I go into a survival mechanism because I don't trust them, or because I can't predict what they're about to do, or I have no ability to make decisions, or there's something that person is doing strikes me as being unfair. There's things that will cause me to have a survival reaction, and there's other things that will. Not liking somebody is really not going to do that.
Thanks.
All right, so let me just point out the last couple of slides here, and then I will, of course, will hang around and answer whatever questions you might have. All of the quotes that I had up above, and you will get a copy of all this. I will export it all as soon as we're done with the session, and we'll send it to Anthony. All of the quotes up above came from one of these books or from one of these articles. So all of these are here if you really want to spend the time digging into them. I have obviously read all of them plus more. I find this stuff fascinating, but it is a very deep rabbit hole. And lastly, just this is who I am. I write about a little more technical stuff up here. I write about this, all the stuff we're talking about tonight, the intersection of unconscious behavior and agile at Unconscious Agile. So I'm calling out a couple of specific links of things you might find interesting. I am also a Kanban trainer, and I have a class coming up. So that is all me. You will get copies of all of those links. Now, is there anything else you would like to discuss? Questions, thoughts?
I have a
Or are
question,
your
but it's,
brains full? Go ahead.
it's not related to the topic. So if somebody has one that's more related, I can wait. Well, it's kind of related. It's not directly related.
Now
Well,
we're
bring it on.
curious.
I think
All right, I'll bring it up.
Now we're dying to know.
Right, right.
So when it comes to Agile, I found for myself, being a sufferer of ADHD, that I found the structure of sprints and stories and committing to the work and delivering the work, at the end of the week or whatever, to be like transformative in, the mental, issues that ADHD brings, right?
Mhm.
And I don't know if there's any of that in the research that you've done around, around this, but it just was a fascinating discovery that I made for myself in retrospect when I looked back at like when the change happened, right? I joined an Agile team that put structure in place, just the right amount of pressure to get things done, very clear, commitments and, working on tickets. And then all of a sudden, like a lot of other things start to fall into place because, that structure gets created, right? So anyway, like I said, it's not
That's-
really related to this, but it's related to the brain and Agile.
Well, that's awesome. I'm not aware of any studies that back that up, but I'm really happy about your experience.
Maybe we should start one.
I wanted to ask about this. When you are in the company, how do you come together all these aspects? I suppose it is required to have like a network of people that are working in favor of this psychological safety. I mean, it's quite difficult if you have an organization that's more not concerned with this, like command and control or something like that, where only one or two people are trying to build this, because all the rest remaining, the effort could be, so to say, destroyed by the remaining part of the leadership.
I
Right.
find these days that most companies are at least paying lip service to psychological safety. They talk about it, they say we want more of it, but they're not necessarily taking steps to make it happen. And I think in large part it's because they don't know what to do. They recognize the benefits, they see that people are more productive when they're psychologically safe, but they don't know what would be involved in actually getting to that place. That's my suspicion. Now, obviously, there's some companies that really don't care, that are all command and control, and they're going to tell you what to do. I choose not to work for places like that. And that's a choice for everybody. So I'm doing what I can to help people understand what things they can do, layering in on the safety model here, finding different things that we can do in our environment to make things better. And so that's how I am trying to improve psychological safety in general, giving people the actual tools so that we're not talking in platitudes anymore.
One thing that strikes me, I mean, you mentioned a lot of research and books, so you really gave you invest a lot of time on this. I'm curious, I mean, agile coach is a term nowadays that has a lot of different meanings to different people, but there is a part of the agile coach that's related to more technical aspect, like coaching on like TDD or things like that. Are you still doing this kind of work? Are you able to juggle all these different parts of the job?
I do. I am happy to sit and write code with programmers and also talk about psychological safety and leadership and all that. But in fairness, there aren't a lot of coaches that work with this kind of stuff. It's easier to find a coach who can write code than it is to find a coach that can really dive into the neuroscience. But that's changing. That's changing. There's more and more appreciation, more and more coaches studying up on psychology and neuroscience, a lot more taking formal coaching programs. So we're starting to see more and more of it. It's just right now it's still early days. Okay. Well, again, I'll hang around as long as you want, but thank you for your time tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
If you got something
Thank
you
you.
out of it.
Yeah, I
Great
think-
presentation. Thanks for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us.
Thanks for putting up with the questions, Mike.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Really appreciate having you. And thanks everyone for joining us today, and appreciate all the questions and the participation.
Thank you, guys.
So I'll share, when Mike shares that with me, I'll either post it to the message board for this meetup event. So if you go back to the link where you accepted the meetup invitation to come, there's a message board there. So you'll either get it there, or I'll email it to everyone who attended.
Yeah, you'll have it in a couple of minutes. I just started the export.
Awesome. Okay. I think that's it. I think we're up on time. So take care, everyone. And please join us again.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
right, take care. Thanks, Mike.
Bye. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, you're welcome.